When we think about the Civil War, our minds usually go straight to the soldiers, the big battles, the famous generals, but what we don't always think about are the kids. For hundreds of thousands of children, this wasn't some chapter in a history book. It was what was happening right outside their front door. It wasn't history to them, it was just life. So let's really dive into what that life was. Really think about that for a second. What if instead of just reading about major historical events, you were actually living through them? The sounds of cannons weren't from a movie, they were coming from the next town over. This was the absolute reality for kids during the American Civil War, and their experiences were incredibly different and, well, really complicated.
So, how did this whole thing even start for them? Well, it might surprise you. Before anyone really understood how horrible it would be, for a lot of kids, the war felt like a giant, exciting party, kind of like a parade that just kept going.
And this picture, wow, it just captures that feeling perfectly. What we're seeing here are kids at Studley Ford in Virginia. They're all gathered to watch soldiers march off to what would become the very first major battle of the war, Bull Run. For them, it wasn't a march to something terrifying, it was a show. There was this real sense of excitement and just plain old curiosity.
And this gets right to the heart of how kids process the world around them, right? They copied what they saw the adults doing. They'd form their own little pretend armies, they'd play war games, and they'd even get into arguments about the politics they were hearing at the dinner table. It was their way of trying to make sense of this huge, confusing thing by turning it into a game.
Yeah, that excitement, it just couldn't last. There's this one story about a mother who finally gave in and let her two sons go watch a battle happening nearby. They had been begging to see the action up close, but when they got home that night, they were different. They weren't the same kids. They had seen what war was really like, and it was nothing like a game. The spectacle had become a trauma.
As the war dragged on, that innocent, naive view just evaporated. For so many children, their childhood, as they knew it, was just over. The needs of the war effort became their new reality.
Okay, think about your childhood responsibilities. Homework, maybe some chores, feeding the dog. Now look at this. The roles are just worlds apart. We are talking about kids having to take on these unbelievably adult jobs, all because so many of the men were gone fighting.
And let's be clear, these were not just extra chores. This was serious, vital work. Kids, both white and enslaved, were absolutely essential to keeping things running back home. They were scraping lint off old clothes to make bandages, working in super dangerous ammunition factories, and trying to find food for soldiers. Enslaved teenagers were often forced to go with their enslavers into the war itself or to sew uniforms and take care of the wounded. And for many enslaved children, the war actually made their workload even more intense. With men gone from the plantations, really young kids were forced into hard labor in the fields at an age they normally wouldn't have been. Their lives, which were already so difficult, just got that much harder. As the war pushed on, things in the South, where most of the fighting was happening, got really, really bad. Just surviving became the main goal, and children had to face things that are, well, they're hard for us to even imagine today. With armies constantly on the move, fear was just everywhere. There was the fear of soldiers, from either side, just bursting into your home, the fear of violence, the fear of starving as food ran out. And for enslaved children, there was that constant, terrifying fear of being sold away from their families, a threat that the chaos of war made even more real. But what was actually happening on the ground could be really complex. This story about George Robertson, an 8-year-old from North Carolina, is just fascinating. He was terrified when Union soldiers took over his house, saying they were loud and intimidating. But then, those very same soldiers put a guard outside to protect his family, and that guard became so close to them that he started calling George's mom Mother. It just goes to show you that even in a war, these human moments can pop up when you least expect them. The deepest hardship, though, was loss. Losing fathers, brothers, their homes. It was a constant part of life. And I don't think anything captures this more than one of the most famous images from the entire war, which came from a tiny little photograph found clutched in the hand of a fallen soldier. Sergeant Amos Humiston died at Gettysburg holding this photo of his 3 children. For months, nobody knew who he was. Then this picture was copied and published in newspapers all over the North. It became this powerful symbol of the personal cost of the war, and people sold copies of it to raise money for an orphanage for soldiers' kids. So in a way, his tragic loss helped give a home to other children who had lost everything. In the middle of all this chaos, there were also these glimmers of hope.
As enslaved people escaped from plantations, many of them ran towards the Union Army for protection. The Army set up these places called contraband camps. They were basically refugee camps where Black families could be safe, earn some money, and, this is huge, get an education for their children, something they had been denied for generations. So when the war finally ended in April of 1865, you think it would be one big moment of relief for everyone, right? Well, not so much. For the kids who lived through it all, the end of the war meant completely different things depending on who they were. I mean, the difference is just night and day. For a lot of white children in the South, the news that the Confederacy had lost was just devastating. They were scared of the future, like their whole world had been flipped upside down. But for Black children, that same exact news brought pure joy. When they saw Union troops marching in, they didn't see invaders, they saw liberators. But, emancipation wasn't some magic wand that fixed everything overnight. For the newly freed children and their families, that hope for the future was immediately slammed with the harsh reality of what came next, the period we call Reconstruction. Freedom was just the first step on a very, very long and difficult road. Their families were faced with these impossible situations. I mean, do you stay and work for the same person who used to enslave you, or do you leave with absolutely nothing and face terrible poverty? They were up against intense racism, the rise of violent hate groups, new laws creating segregation. The fight for real freedom was a long way from being over. And this, right here, is the lasting legacy of it all. These experiences these kids had, they didn't just go away. The war shaped them into the adults they became. It molded their views on everything, on race, on government, on their place in the world. And those feelings, born out of all that trauma and change, were then passed down to their own kids, creating a legacy that, honestly, we're still grappling with today. The children of the Civil War were witnesses to and part of events that completely remade their country. They didn't really have a choice in the matter. It kind of makes you think, doesn't it? What are the big historical moments that we're living through right now? And how are those moments shaping the kids who are going to be shaping our future?